All right, guys, so here's lecture 4. We're going to talk about energy systems. Now, keep in mind, this is going to be a little longer than I like, but it's going to go through both the substrates and the energy pathways during exercise. So there's a lot of information to get through, so bear with me. And pardon me if I sneeze or cough. I am under the weather a little bit, so bear with me, please. But as I've mentioned before, we haven't gotten into the videos yet, but bonking or hitting the walls often associated with a lack of nutrition, lack of nutrients, and energy depletion along the way, right? So there are many books and many theories out there, and many programs to follow on proper nutrition and training. And I do want to make a caveat that I am not a nutritionist or a registered dietitian. I will go over some general guidelines um, on what substrates are and the pathways through which they work. So at no point through this will I be making recommendations on diets or what you should eat or what you shouldn't eat, just what the common ideas are out. But these are some common high sugar, high glucose, very quick ways of getting that glucose into your bloodstream and therefore being utilized. I have used three of these. The Espresso Love is one of my favorites, although it is rather sugary. I now use a lot of the Hammer Nutrition. And those sports greens are really good. Not only are they high in carbohydrates, but they have a lot of electrolytes. But um, these are the idea is the longer you work out and the longer you train, you need to input some sort of carbohydrates into your system during the run, or protein slash carbohydrate, or fat slash carbohydrate, whatever you want to do. This table here is kind of a mix of what you might see at an endurance, ultra endurance run, or a big endurance race where they have a medley of fat and sugar and salt and salty potato chips, very um, chocolate and artificial sugars to get in your system. A lot of times you'll also see the pizzas and flat soda or stale soda, so it gets rid of the carbon and fat. Again, is a shot of sugar into your system. But we first want to talk about what happens as food as it gets into your body and this fuel source, right? So the path of the food breakdown during digestion, it enters the mouth, where it begins the mechanical breakdown through chewing. There are some enzymatic processes that start to begin in your mouth, but for the most part, it's just that mechanical breakdown. The esophagus transports the food to the stomach. Stomach further mechanically digests the food, and this is truly where you have the chemical breakdown beginning with some of the activities, the pepsin, hydrochloric acid, those type of things that happen, along with the mucus that protects the stomach wall. Um, there is a very small amount of absorption in the stomach, but we also do see some of that beginning there as well. And then you travel on to the most part to the small intestine, and this continues the chemical breakdown, and this is the major portion of a lot of the absorption. Many of your macronutrients are absorbed here, and many of like protease, sucrase, amylase, bile acid, lipase. These are all sort of the enzymatic processes that happen here in the small intestine. And then it travels on to the large intestine, where this is a lot of the reabsorption of the water and vitamins occur. And then everything's stored and it's began to pack as the fecal matter and feces to go ahead and there are still a little bit more of the digestion going on, but for the most part, this is the absorption of water, and then the fecal matter goes, um, and then you, of course, you expend it all through the anus and the rectum, and that's the process through which we absorb our fuel and our energy sources from food we digest. Just real quickly, so we have the three macronutrients. Anywhere in this PowerPoint you see CHO in capitals, it's carbohydrate. Lipids will be the lipids or fats. There's many different types of lipids, and fats is one of them. And then proteins. A little table there, you have the carbohydrates, proteins, fat, and my favorite, the alcohol. But these are all the kcals that are associated with 1 gram of that. And you'll come to notice that fat and lipids are the highest producing caloric for per gram, and that's one of the reasons why we like to use those as an energy source. So we'll begin our discussion on the energy substrates um, with carbohydrate. You'll see it broken up into the carbo and hydrate. This is really identifying the fact that carbohydrates will always be connected or attracting water in the body. So whenever you take one of those supplements on the previous slide, like the GUs or the high carbohydrate, high glucose concentrated supplements during your run, you need to also take a little bit of water within it. Otherwise, it will help dehydrate you in your system. But we'll talk about the three types: monosaccharides, oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides. I'm not going to get too far into that. You just know that the monos are the simples, oligio are sucrose, lactose, so they're also simple sugars. The poly are your more complex. They're a combination of three or more of the sugars, where you have your starch, your fibers, and your glycogens. And then you have the old food pyramid there. You have the grains and vegetables on the bottom, both comprising of the carbohydrate subgroup. Um, but just real quick here, a discussion on some glucose metabolism. So the absorbed carbohydrate is transported to the liver. Glucose is stored in two forms of glycogen. So glycogen is a storage form of glucose from the body, and it either stores it in the liver or the skeletal muscle or heart. Glycogen is the only storage form, and glucose is important substrate for the brain. Now, this is one of the areas that I really hesitate when people tell me they're cutting out carbohydrates in an extremely low carbohydrate diet. Now, I'm not saying you need to go on a high carbohydrate diet, but many of the fat loss regimes out there are producing this extremely low carbohydrate diet. I used to have a client of mine who was on um, I can't HCG diet, and she was eating 500 calories a day, taking a shot, and she's um, was weight training and working out. You're not supposed to do those type of things when you're taking that kind of diet because you just don't have the energy, right? So your brain needs a certain amount of glucose just to maintain life every single day. So be careful with what you're doing, but many people have made it work, and we'll see what happens. But glucose is the important substrate for both the brain and kidneys. Um, and this just kind of goes through a little bit of a diagram for you of where it's stored and how it's distributed. But glycogen, again, remember, is the only storage form. So to talk a little bit more about the carbohydrate concept and substrate, you have the glycose, right? So you have the formation of glycogen from a non-carbohydrate source, which is glyconeogenesis. You have the formation of the glycogen molecule from the carbohydrate source, so the glycogenesis. So these two are going to be the storage form. And then you have the breakdown of glycogen to glucose. Now we're talking about being able to use that stored glycogen as energy substrate. And that's glycogenolysis. The rate at which glucose is released by the liver for muscle consumption at rest is very minimal. And you can see how per hour during exercise, 60 grams. We will talk a little bit about the storage of glycogen is limited. So that 60 grams can deplete your energy storage pretty rapidly, depending on what intensity your exercise is at. So next I want to focus on one of the concepts that relates to bonking and hitting the wall, and that is hypoglycemia. Now, hypoglycemia is solely a reduced blood glucose concentration, and it's thought to be the underlying cause of the central nervous system fatigue. And that's because of the reliance of the brain and central nervous system on glucose as its sole energy source. So as that reduces, it can no longer function correctly. We'll see this in some of the bonking and hitting the wall videos that we'll see in class. You'll see how these people continue to try to go, but they lack some sort of connection, and they're like wet noodles out there. But some of the symptoms are reduced ability to concentrate, sudden feeling of weakness, and this intense desire to stop running. But then you get to this hysteria and kind of alternate world out there where you see people continuing to move like they can't control it, like they don't know how to stop. But if you talk to them, it's like they wanted to, but they just couldn't. But it's important to notice that glycogen that is stored in the muscle cannot be directly broken down and used in the muscle as glucose. It's first broken down into pyruvate, and then has to go through the cycles and bioenergetics to create the glucose molecule. So it's kind of a not an easy process, but it can be done. A little history on what hypoglycemia has produced and why people believe that these ingesting of carbohydrates during energy or during exercise can sustain or reduce blood glucose reductions. Noakes states three very historical studies. The first is in 1924 Boston Marathon. Doctors studied runners um, as they finished the race and found a strong correlation between the athletes who were in very poor condition and their blood glucose levels. Virtually all the runners they had studied had a reduction in blood glucose, um, but those that were in the worst condition were um, those that had lower blood glucose levels in the hypoglycemia area. So what they did down in 1925 is, back in those days, the same runners ran every year. It wasn't as popular as it is today. So those runners who came back and ran the next race the next year, they were encouraged if they had hypoglycemia from the last year to increase carbohydrate intake prior to and during the run, and found that virtually all of them had an increase, in performance, as well as they did not have the same reduction in blood glucose levels. And then in 1932, at a Harvard fatigue lab, they had a couple dogs that were running on treadmills. And while they fed these dogs sweets during their treadmill run, they could run nonstop for about 24 hours. Um, but when they removed that ingestion during exercise, the dogs couldn't last more than 6 hours. So this is another idea of that carbohydrate ingestion in the form of glucose. And the final one he talks about is in 1939. This is the Stockholm cyclists, but they were cycling, um, and I don't know if they were on a trainer or if they were outdoors, or if they were what kind of cycle they were doing, maybe on a stationary cycle. But those that were exhausted and depleted after 90 minutes, they took 200 grams of carbohydrates, and they found that they were able to not only reverse the blood glucose concentration levels, or the reduction that was forming, but they were also able to continue riding for a longer period of time. So you start to develop from these three studies where you can now kind of see how this carbohydrate concept comes into play with all of these research. So we'll go on to our next topic, our next substrate. That's going to be fat or lipids, lipids or fats. There's three basic groups: simple, compound, or derived. Triglycerides make up 95% of the fat in your body. There's a glycerol molecule and three fatty acids, and then this is truly the breaking down of the glycerol and three fatty acids where the energy comes from, through many processes that we'll talk in a minute. You have compound, which is simple plus other chemicals, right? So these are like your lipoproteins. It's fat that's transported in the blood. It's connected to a protein that allows it to be transported. Then you have stuff that's derived, like cholesterols, and you have the bad and the good, and we won't get into much of that. That's for another class. But the process is, here you have pancreatic enzymes that digest in the small intestine. It's then absorbed through the small intestinal wall into the bloodstream, where it is then transported to the liver, and it's repackaged for either its end site of adipose tissue or skeletal muscle, and then it's stored, whether it's stored for later use or it's stored um, for fat deposits. But that is where we go. To further discuss the process of fats or lipids being broken down, we have to discuss lipase. So lipase is the hormone-sensitive enzyme that is tasked with deconstructing the triglyceride into its glycerol and three fatty acids. It is a hormone-sensitive enzyme, which means the action of the enzyme is regulated by other hormones in the blood. And two of the major ones are insulin and adrenaline. Insulin reduces the activity of lipase, which is then reducing the amount of fat being used, or it increases the glycogen usage. The opposite is adrenaline, which increases lipase activity, therefore accelerating the fat utilization, which therefore decreases the reliance on glycogen. So we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but so the theory is training can increase that muscle triglyceride usage for energy, sparing some of the glycogen usage. This truly comes into play when we start talking about lactate threshold training, where you're trying to push back or increase the amount of intensity level that you can work. Because remember, a lower percentage of VO2 max is going to allow you to rely a little bit more on your fat utilization because you're at a lower intensity, which we'll talk a little bit more about here coming up. This is just a little schematic for you. You have the adipose tissue broken down to glycerol and fatty acids, and following it all the way down to the mitochondria, where it makes ATP from acetyl coenzyme A, from the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. So just a little schematic to make things a little bit easier for you. Some people like those drawings. The final substrate we're going to talk about is protein. And of course, proteins are made up of amino acids. It's going to be converted to glucose or glycogen in the liver. And it's a skeletal muscle usage is repair. So that's the major function, right? Is to repair and build skeletal muscle. The structural components are actin and myosin. And it's a very low energy contributor. So the goal is not to use protein as an energy source. It comes into play mostly in extreme starvation situations, and those situations where exercise lasts 3+ hours. And at that point, it could yield up to 10% of the total energy production. Now, I wanted to quickly touch on the energy storage capabilities of each of the substrates. We'll talk about carbohydrate first, and it's dependent upon your level of training as well as your dietary choices. Untrained individuals are going to store about 280 grams within their muscles. And then trained individuals on days that they're resting or relaxing can reach up to, have been measured up to 720 grams. And then it drops to about 420 during training days because they're actually using the stored glycogen as their energy source. But they can replenish and build up quite a bit. Fat is one of those ones that has an unlimited amount of storage, right? So these are the percentages that are found in elite athletes or male and female endurance athletes, 4 to 7% and 6 to 15%. So these are very lean individuals, and they're half to a little bit more than half the body fat percentage of a typical person. And the fastest or the lowest that's been recorded in an endurance athlete is the 9th fastest half marathoner at 3.5%. But this range of spectrum is pretty large. And then the final one, of course, is protein. This is tightly regulated, and what you'll find is you're pretty constant unless you get to that starvation, or unless you get to a point of long endurance to where you start to build up some keto acidosis and breakdown of the muscle, and produce a very unhealthy environment in your body. But this is the last source of energy that we'll be using, and actually the storage is pretty tightly compact depending on your training. So now I want to switch gears a little bit and finish talking about the substrates for a while and begin to talk about the energy pathways and how we create energy from those substrates. But first we need to talk about adenosine triphosphate and ATP. It's a high energy compound. It's considered the immediate source of energy and actually the only source of energy within the system that we use for it to create motion and create that mechanical work. And you'll see this image here depicted in a bunch of wheels because it's a continual process, right? So you break down ATP into the ADP in phosphate, inorganic phosphate plus the energy, and then it resynthesizes back to ATP, creates the ATP process and continue to produce the energy. But it requires energy to build the ATP, and it requires energy to break up the ATP. So in the binding and creation of the ATP, it actually stores some energy to be released. So it's a process and a continual work process. That's why they have the wheels in this image here. But let's talk about the bioenergetics. Most cells store a limited amount of ATP um, that is just on hand, ready to go. But ATP production from the substrates we've talked about can happen three ways during exercise: phosphocreatine or PC system, glycolysis, and the oxidative pathway. So these are three pathways we'll talk a little bit about. We're not going to go into a crazy amount of detail because you should have had that in a previous exercise phys class, but we'll touch on all of them. It's important to note that back in the day, they felt that one was active and then the other one and then the other one. But it's important to note that we now truly believe that all contribute from the beginning of exercise and are involved at some stage throughout. We, so one is not 100% active the entire time. There's multiple stages and percentages to which each is active. So we begin by talking about phosphocreatine, which is the anaerobic system to begin exercise that is in the most abundance. And simply put, a phosphate group transfers over from the phosphocreatine to the adenosine diphosphate to create ATP, and this is done through the creatine kinase enzyme. And this process is going to be limited by the amount of phosphocreatine within your muscle cells. So as that phosphocreatine is decreased and depleted, you can no longer create ATP through this process. So the ATP PC system is the phosphagen system, provides energy on the onset of exercise. During the short duration, high intensity exercise that dominate it's the dominant energy source. These are activities like sprinting, rapid weightlifting. When you're a football player, you're going for a high jump, or these explosive, high intense activities. This is when we've talked a little bit in class about Usain Bolt, his ability to not decelerate towards the end of a race, right? So he may be able to store a greater amount of this PC in his muscles, therefore allows him to produce a higher rapid energy source here, which doesn't create that reduced speed towards the end of the deceleration that everybody else does. Next, we'll talk about glycolysis, again, an anaerobic system. There's rapid ATP production. The bound energy from glucose rejoins the phosphatidylate back to ADP, creating ATP. This process occurs in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It produces a net of 2 ATP molecules and 2 pyruvate or lactate molecules per glucose molecule. Now, this is where it gets interesting because the lactate or pyruvate end product here depends on the amount of oxygen present. Again, we call this an anaerobic process, but the end product depends on if there's oxygen present. If there's oxygen present, the pyruvate happens and it goes back in the system and creates more and more energy through other pathways. Lactate, the lactic acid buildup, blah, blah, blah. But there also could be the use of lactate through lactate shuttle, which we will talk about next week. The final pathway we'll talk about is oxidative pathway. This is your aerobic pathway that occurs inside the mitochondria. There's a cooperation of two pathways. I'm not gonna make you memorize these. Some endurance physiology classes you are supposed to memorize these, as well as some chemistry classes, maybe even a biology class. I've never memorized them, and I don't think it's as important to memorize them unless you're truly going into nutrition or some other aspect of exercise physiology that this is very, very important. But for our purposes, Krebs cycle, the function is to complete the oxidation of all three substrates using the NAD positive ion and FAD as the hydrogen carriers. And then oxygen does not directly participate in this reaction. So the Krebs cycle is an anaerobic process. And then the electron transport chain, oxygen accepts the final hydrogen from the Krebs cycle, and this is that oxidative phosphorylation process. The three stages, generation of two carbon molecules, acetyl-CoA, coenzyme A, the oxidation of acetyl coenzyme A in the Krebs cycle, and then the oxidation phosphorylation in the electron transport chain. So these are the stages that compose the oxidative process. That first one is the anaerobic process. The last two are going to be where your aerobic comes into play. All substrates may contribute in this perspective. And here's a little diagram of um, protein glycolysis and the breakdown of triglycerides and how they will um, break down further into acetylcoenzyme A and then enter uh, the Krebs cycle to produce energy via oxidative phosphorylation in the electron transport chain. Right, so some are a much more expensive process. Some directly go through glycolysis pyruvate into the other ones have to go through some other steps and processes, um, which makes them more costly to produce. This is just a little schematic from one of my exercise physiology books that I have that talks about percent of aerobic and percent of anaerobic, which different activities are, and then actually it breaks it down into the time that is associated with that. So anything 1 to 3 seconds is considered purely anaerobic. Anything greater than 120 minutes or greater is 100% aerobic. And you can go back in 100-meter dash, soccer, 1500-meter dash, or run and see where everything lies on that diagram. Let's talk a little bit about exercise metabolism. Um, as you know, homeostasis is the steady, unchanging internal environment, and it is the goal of our body to maintain this homeostasis, which is the environment we love to live in. At rest, nearly 100% of the energy produced is done so via aerobic metabolism due to the ability to utilize oxygen very easily. Um, the blood lactate levels are relatively low and they are steady. And a lot of this deals with the energy substrate that we are utilizing at rest. The majority of it is fat. As we transition to oxygen, it's important to understand um, that the consumption of oxygen does not instantaneously increase to its steady state, right? It's a gradual increase. That's why if you do any submaximal testing, you use steady state as an identifier to um, mark when they are at a point of a level of oxygen consumption that is determinant of that intensity level. And they say that this is a reason that benefits the aerobic metabolism present during the initial stages of all aerobic exercise. Um, and then you transition from the ATP PC system all the way up to aerobic pathways in a gradual transition to one over the other. And you can go back and forth in between that depending upon your variance in intensity levels along your run. Right, so if I'm running the half marathon out at Red Rock Loop, there are going to be areas of that run going uphill that I'll probably be transitioning back into an anaerobic pathway, either glycolysis or ATP PC, depending on my intensity level. And then, of course, the duration of exercise also plays a part. So this graph here is a depiction of the differences between liver glycogen, which is yet to be fully understood, the amount of stores in the liver glycogen and how they function during exercise. And then muscle glycogen on the bottom graph. So top graph is liver glycogen levels, bottom graph is going to be your muscle glycogen levels. And you'll see the percentage there. They both have the same x-axis. So think about the top graph as the same x-axis. If you follow that 70% down, it's just under 220%, right? So the rate of usage increases linearly with the increased intensity. So you'll see that both of them kind of drop with a linear descend and decrease that content of the glycogen within itself linearly across time. Average is about 1 gram per minute at exercise intensities of 70 to 85% VO2 max. So their slopes are different, but not greatly different. They're all within pretty much the same range. Liver glycogen depletion is said to occur in about 2.5 hours, where muscle glycogen can last up to about 4 hours. Um, if you begin um, a before marathon with 135 grams, um, and then you also have the 90 km Camaradas marathon. Now, keep in mind that this decrease here is if you don't ingest any carbohydrates along the run. So if I don't ingest any, this is going to be the depletion within my liver glycogen levels. And you'll see how much quicker you run a marathon than if you run a 90 km. And I'm sure you understand that that's because at an intensity level, 85%, you're burning a much greater percentage of glycogen than you are at 70%. You're burning more fat at that point, so you can save those glycogen stores at a much longer rate. And then down at the bottom, it's the muscle glycogen levels, and you can see how at 70% there you can keep those stores quite a bit longer throughout the process. Muscle and liver glycogen depletion depend on two things: intensity and duration. Um, the greatest depletion happens this way, right? So at 42 km at 85% VO2 max, and if I'm doing an ultra marathon, so it's anything above 42K, you'll see it at 70 to 75% VO2 max. So now discuss the influence of duration and intensity. I'm going to go ahead and bring all this up. So short term or intense is dominated by the anaerobic metabolism system. Considers up to 5 seconds. Adenosine triphosphate phosphotreakin system. Beyond 5 seconds, and especially up to the 20-second, you have a shift to glycolysis. And then anything 45 seconds or plus, it's a combination of all three of the energy systems. Prolonged exercise, anything more than 10 minutes. This is primary aerobic. And again, you're gonna understand the steady state, which is that maintained during submaximal moderate intensity exercise. It takes you a few minutes to reach it, but if you can maintain an intensity level there, then you're pretty good. It's kind of like maintenance of power output on cycling that we were talking about the other day in class. If you can maintain the power output, then you're going to be pretty relative steady state in the intensity level there. Except the exceptions causing upward drift of the steady state or the prolonged exercise are hot, humid environments and continuous at a high relative work rate. So anything greater than 75% VO2 max. So these are going to take you out of that primary aerobic exercise and shift you back towards the other two metabolic pathway systems. So intensity, fat primary at low intensity, 30% VO2 max. Carbohydrate takes over at your higher intensities, beginning around 70%. There's a progressive shift in reliance, and we'll talk here shortly about what this can and happens. It's important to understand that fat cannot be mobilized or burned quickly enough, supplying energy at these high intensities, and that's why we shift over to the carbohydrate, because they're much more rapid in the process. There's a crossover point, so that's where the crossover point tends to be where carbohydrate becomes more dominant. Some say it's due to recruitment of fast fibers or increasing blood levels of epinephrine. You'll see a lot of people start talking about the lactate turn point or ventilatory threshold. These are all kind of concepts where that crossover point occurs from fat to primary carbohydrate. 95% VO2 max carbohydrate is a sole source. Again, this is one of the contentions of Tim Noakes, where he believes that even at 100% VO2 max, you still may have some contribution of fat. And again, this may be dietary, it may be many contributions, but he's a very strong proponent of that your body will not allow itself to be carbohydrate depleted. Therefore, no matter what the intensity level, you're still going to be burning some sort of fat as a energy substrate. So now, when we talk about submaximal testing, even when we do maximal testing, one of our criteria is RER, or respiratory exchange ratio. And this is an estimate of the contribution of what percentage carbohydrate or fat substrates are being used um, as the source to metabolize to produce energy during exercise. It is a ratio of the volume of carbohydrate, or sorry, carbon dioxide, um, relative to the volume of oxygen consumed. So as you breathe out, it measures your CO2 and it knows what your breathing is as opposed as it is related to oxygen. Um, how can they do this, right? So carbohydrates and fat differ in the amount of oxygen used and the amount of carbon dioxide produced during oxidation. Um, so through this process, they know um, what the usage percentages of oxygen versus carbohydrate, and that's how they would dictate what source is substrate. And it's important to note that um, protein is just ignored in this process, right? So protein is very minimally used, and generally just for your very extreme conditions. So we'll ignore those when we do this. Now, it's important to note when we do these, steady state must be achieved if we want to relate the relationship between oxygen and carbon dioxide. Because if it's variable, then we don't know, right? So once we achieve steady state, we can say, okay, this is the RER at that submaximal speed, which is a great way for us to talk about the intensity level of an athlete. Fat oxidation requires more oxygen than carbohydrate because carbohydrate contains more oxygen. There's approximately 6% more energy per liter of ATP of a liter of oxygen obtained when using carbohydrate as a fuel source over fat. So the RER, or the respiratory range ratio, ranges between 1 and 0.7. It is unlikely that one substrate is sole provider. Now, when we do these testing, it says here the RER ranges from 1 to 0.07, but it actually goes greater than 1. And one of the criteria for VO2 max testing is that it goes upwards of 1.1 or 1.15 is what I like to use, which I believe is what UNLV typically uses itself. But here is a breakdown of the R value on the left, the percentage of fat, and the percentage of carbohydrate, and then the calories per liter of oxygen. And so here you have it broken down, right? So the more intense you're working out, you're closer to a 1R. You're burning more carbohydrate, but you're also burning more calories per liter of oxygen. Um, so this is a very important concept going back to some training. You can work at a very low intensity, burn a higher percentage of fat, but you're burning less calories per liter of oxygen. So there's trade-offs, but depending on your training plan is where you're going to fall in here. But one way to use this when it relates to submaximal testing is if you have somebody run it at a set submaximal speed or cycle at a submaximal power, and they test at an oxygen consumption and an RER value, you put them through a training regime, you come back and test them again. Um, a great thing would be is if they could be at a higher percentage of oxygen but a lower RER. That means they're able to sustain a higher percentage of their VO2 max, but their intensity level is a little lower with the RER value. So here we have just a couple of the same exact graph depicted a couple different ways. Um, the one area they disagree on is when you are at 0% fat and 100% carbohydrate, but that's just nitpicking depending on the number of data that they have. You can see the one on the right has fewer data drawn. They only have 5 data points. The other one has numerous. So the one on the right may be missing some extra data. But you'll see the relationship of carbohydrate and fat, and when there's a transition into burning more carbohydrate as a source as a percentage of VO2 max, which they're both extremely similar, between 35 and 40%, or between 30 and 40%, generally at 35% of your VO2 max. Carbohydrate utilization is the greatest at high intensities, and this is in the form of utilizing muscle glycogen. And 90% or training intensities done at greater than 90% are maybe the most affecting training intensities for rapid improvements. Um, and this is a lot why you're HIIT training. Some people love CrossFit. You'll see track repeats, you'll see fartleks. These are all different training mechanisms to get rapid improvements in your substrate utilization and push back some lactate thresholds. And you'll see some great trends in your performance when you do this. Let's shift now to duration, where anything greater than 30 minutes, moderate intensity, 40 to 59% VO2 max, RER decreases over time. That's meaning you are going to begin to incorporate more of your fat utilization and shift away from your carbohydrate utilization over time. Noakes relates this shift due to the slowing of the rate of muscle glycogen breakdown as muscle glycogen concentration falls, rather than to a reduced rate of muscle glucose uptake by the muscles. So it's not there as opposed to the inability to uptake it. So this concept of lipolysis, lipase is inactive until lipase is stimulated by other hormones, and those are a few of the hormones there for you. At low intensities, exercise increases epinephrine, which increases lipase activity, which then increases the blood and muscle free fatty acids. This promotes fat metabolism. So theoretically, as duration increases, your intensity is also going to decrease. But if it stays up there, this concept of shifting towards fat as a utilization source is going to increase. And you can see in this graph here, it's pretty steady at about 20. So about 20 minutes of your time, you do have a shift going towards fat. And now keep in mind, this is without taking any of those glucose polymer goo packet substrates during your run. So if you just went out and ran for that long, this is what it would be. Again, here's the depiction of exercise time, percentage of total energy expenditure of muscle triglycerides, plasma free fatty acids, blood glucose, and muscle glycogen. So as your time increases, muscle glycogen drops drastically. You start to increase your reliance on blood glucose. This is going to be a lot due to the food ingesting during the activity level. Muscle triglycerides then decrease as well. Right now you have your plasma free fatty acids through so many breakdown mechanisms. So to end this conversation here, I just want to talk about the substrate contributions to endurance athletics. Carbohydrate, glycogen is a storage form. You have muscle and liver glycogen. Muscle glycogen is that direct source of energy. Liver glycogen is the product of replacing blood glucose. The contribution of muscle glycogen versus blood glucose depends upon the intensity and duration of exercise, with the blood glucose levels being greater at your lower intensities and longer duration components of exercise. Fat or lipids. So most fat is stored as triglycerides in adipose sites, which is the fat cells. Must be degraded to free fatty acids because the plasma free fatty acids are primarily used for low intensity, but as we saw, as duration increases, we start to utilize more of those plasma free fatty acids. Muscle triglycerides increase with your work rate. And then we have 65 to 85% of your VO2 max. At this workload, plasma free fatty acids and muscle triglycerides are about equal contributors to your energy substrates. So that is going to be our talk on energy substrates and their utilization pathways. Come ready to class on Friday, because what I want to do is we're going to talk about bonking, and then I want to discuss a little bit more on training mechanisms that you can utilize either way. And then I'm also going to show you a little bit of Tim Noakes's theories now on the high fat, lower carbohydrate diets and what he's saying on that. So look forward to it, and I'll be posting the quiz on a Wednesday. Bye.